Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. We are now ready to move on to the third session, the third and the last before the roundtable discussion, session, the narratives of crisis and the public sphere. The speakers on this panel require no further introduction, I guess, so I think we can move on to the paper straight away. So Dimitris, whenever you're ready.
Μπορείς να βλέπεις το θάνατο όπου το θέλεις.
Στέλλα, εσύ που πας. Στέλιο, εσύ εδώ, με τη μάνα σου. Μάνα! Μάνα!
Ω Θεοδόρα, εμένα θα τα βάλεις ρε. Πού δεν σε βοήθησα.
Να λες ψέματα 20 χρόνια.
Video for the film Hora Proelefsis, and the point was to see. Shall I speak from this one? It's not the mic. It's not the mic. It's not the mic. So, for instance, if I speak with this one, like that, okay. All right, okay. So maybe I'll. I think it's because we're very close to that. Anyway, can you? I don't mind speaking here. The whole point showing you a little bit from Dogtooth and then the full video from Hora Proelefsis was to remind you of all those films we've been seeing in the last 3, 4, 5 years, even abroad, even outside Greece. Those Greek films that have captured international attention, also in festivals and with the film going public, especially in countries like Britain or in Central European countries. Half a century after the celebrated anthropological monographs on Greek kinship, about films have started talking about the Greek family again, and have been making critics talk about that too. What were these strange, weird films about? Critics had started wondering. Why have they so much been talking about families in disarray, as you saw the last film sort of doing, and families steeped into violence and extreme forms of control? For some critics, both in Greece and outside Greece, the answer was easily provided by a film like Hora Proelefsis, Country of Origin, by Silas Droumerkas. The main character of that film, Sterios, is the son of a dysfunctional extended family and possibly of an incestuous relationship between his mother and his grandfather, himself engaged in a violent love triangle with his cousin and his brother. The traumatic and violent story of his life is being told, though, in a film called Hora Proelefsis, Country of Origin, with constant references to the affective past of this family, but also to the visual archive of the Greek post-war history and recent events. I have shown the promotional video of this film, and I wanted you to remember that moment where we saw three words: exapatise, prodose, tromokratise, deceived, betrayed, terrorized. According to the director in many interviews, these three words are the key to understand his films, and they are not meant for the one character in the film who actually does these things, but actually for the family, not even for the family of that film, for the Greek family and its strategies in general, he says, implying as well that these words, exapatise, prodose, tromokratise, deceived, betrayed, terrorized, have to be understood so also for the country of origin, for Hora Proelefsis. Yeah? What I will do today is start from these films and share with you a kind of reading that starts from novels, films, and tries to talk about ways of conceptualizing the current forms of belonging in Greece, identity, and the crisis, and talk a little bit about what I think these films and other cultural production is pointing towards in relation to what we have been discussing all day today. I have to say that after my paper, there's Antonis Liakos' paper, which perhaps ties in better with what you've just heard, but as my focus is a little bit more narrow, as you will see, I think it's better to return to the discussion we've just had with the previous paper in the end. So, for a moment, a little bit, stay with me to hear a couple of readings of films and novels that you may have seen or not, you may have read or not. But stay with me, I think it's evident what I want to say with them. As films like Strela, Dogtooth, The Alps, Homeland, as well as Athina Tsagaris' Attenberg, or Yannis Economidis' The Knifer and Philippos Tsitsos' Strange World, made it to the international stage in recent years, critics both in and out of Greece picked up on their common characteristics. They all seemed to belong to a younger generation of filmmakers who wanted to talk about identity in new ways, did not have big budgets or state funding at their disposal, were interested in genre film, video art, or other new experimental forms of filmmaking. This was, as The Guardian put it in a big spread in August 2011, a set of brilliantly strange films, not a new wave, but a weird wave of Greek cinema. And this term, weird wave of Greek cinema, has stayed with us ever since, actually denoted the new film production that happens in Greece, and also film production that is somehow related to the current situation in Greece. The weird Greek wave of Greek cinema. The weird wave of the Greek cinema. I still can hear this noise, and it is a problem. I don't know if I keep moving out, is it better? It is better? Yeah, it is not nice for me, but it is. Okay. As I said, critics have singled out the two topics that seem to engage most of these directors. A persistent representation of violence and a common interest in family dynamics. In the most discussed of these films, what is in focus is family as trouble, or what I call family trouble. It's the family trouble that comes in the focus of all these films, and you can go back and see that actually Greek directors have had this interest for a little bit more than 3 or 4 years, and go back to at least 8, 9 years. 2004, 2003 is an early film called Matchbox that actually belongs to that same category. Families in tatters that try to say something. And the question remains, what made all these directors return to the family? What is it that Ioannidou and all these directors, but also the writers and the stage directors and artists, want to say by this thematic return to family? If you were, if you keep a little bit more, if you are informed about what is happening in culture in Greece, you would have seen that it is not only films that are now interested in the family dynamics, but more and more theatre, performance art, and literature. I mean, it's an amazing number of novels that have been published even this year that actually talk about return to the theme of the family. One thing that does unite Greece's new generation is a preoccupation with family, Athina Tsagari observes in an interview with The Guardian. It's a Greek obsession. The reason our politics and economy is in such trouble is that it is run as a family. It's who you know that counts. In a larger sense, she continues, young Greeks are up against the tyranny of their ancestry, of Greece's nostalgia for its own history, and they think that the 21st century is something that all of us are trying to subvert. So here you go. Family is used as the springboard to launch critique against what is happening in Greece. Two main explanations have been provided by this recent turn to family in cultural texts. The first sees the family as a metonymy of Greek society, a part of the whole. The second sees it as a metaphor, as the symbol of the society. The first reading, the metonymic, revisits old kinship models and the dichotomy between private and public, and argues that as kinship changes in the world, so does its effect in countries like Greece on the larger social, political, and cultural domains. New family structures are emerging in Greece as Greeks enter new affective arrangements and manage novel kinship relations. The old kinship system of extended family seems more and more a thing of the past. In a fast-changing society, the family becomes the arena where the pressures of late modernization are played out. And the Ioannidou is coming out into the demos, or at least out of the closet, as Michael Hirschfeld has observed in a peculiarly interesting recent article. So, one way to conceptualize this turn to the family is to think that family changes everywhere, family changes in Greece, relationships are changing, and that already says something about new models of society. Suddenly what was thought as very private is bursting out. This is the model, as I said, that sees the family as the metonymy of a whole society. So the society is there, and there's a molecule that is the family, and the crisis in the family somehow affects the bigger crisis. The second way we read this recent turn to family in novels, literature, and performance is to see it as a metaphor of contemporary Greek society and its problems. Thus, Lanthimos' films, both in terms of Dogtooth and the Alps, for those who haven't seen them, two very, very famous films around the world, have been seen both in terms of their story but also in terms of their style as precisely and persistently related to the Greek crisis, even though Lanthimos, the director himself, has insisted that they are not, or that they may not. A deep distrust of the Greek family, or of the family seen as the film, is seen therefore as a distrust, again, Greek society as a whole, but the family there is seen as I said, the symbol, as a metaphor. Yeah? What you saw in the first video I showed you, which is like a family gathering, can be seen as, for instance, a big celebration, state celebration. You see this as a metaphor of the big thing that has a problem. With these two complementary readings, family as a metaphor and family as a metonym, we return back to this idea that all these directors actually, and all these other cultural producers are trying to say something about the crisis. It is interesting that it is at the same time this happens that there is a discussion in Greece about the Greek family possibly becoming also the solution of the crisis in financial and economic terms. I mean, there have been many critics who talk about returning to the family either because people don't have money to live alone or because the family as a molecule of production should now be reinvigorated in order to get through the crisis. I have revisited these arguments in other papers and in a current book-length project, which is called There is Something About the Family. And I try to complicate these basic readings. What I further argue is that we have to also realize that the sudden return to and preoccupation with the family in Greek cultural narratives points to a larger ethnocultural narrative frame that is now being challenged. It is the cultural, ideological, political, and social work that the Agia Elliniki Ikogenia, the sacred Greek family, has been performing as an institution, but also as a symbol of Greekness, that also emerged today as the grounds for critique. And this challenge has deep and important consequences about the ways the arena of the political and the social are currently played out in Greece, and the modalities in which we revisit the recent past. That is, apart from the fact that there is a discussion about what role has the family played in Greek society, there is now a huge effort to undermine the basic symbol that we have been trying to understand Greek society through, that is the family. Yeah? So it is in terms, even as an image that the Greek family is emanating at the moment, it's kind of this idea of noise. It's a Greek family noise. You saw the second clip, how noisy it was and how... So what I want to... So this is a larger argument I'm playing with in other work. What I try to do today, in the remaining time, is to focus more on one particular aspect that this discussion often forgets. That area that we could easily think as lying between the domains of the extended family and kinship networks and the actual mechanics of the state or the fantasy of the nation. That area we could call the public sphere. Remember the phrase director Rachel Changari said in the quotation I mentioned a moment ago. She said, "The reason our politics and economy is in such trouble is that it is run as a family. It's who you know that counts." What lies between the sphere of the family and the mechanics of the state, what is implicitly the critical focus of even Changari's statement here, is close to what is called by social theorists the public sphere. The public sphere understood as a discursive space in which individuals and groups congregate to discuss matters of mutual interest and, where possible, to reach a common judgment. The public sphere that can be seen as a theater in modern societies in which political participation is enacted through the medium of talk, and a realm of social life in which public opinion can be formed. These are very simple ways to understand the public sphere, but let's operate with them for the moment. So what I want to argue today is that one of the ways to understand this turn to family in complex cultural texts, in recent complex cultural texts in Greece, and those of you who are in Greece or who are in contact will understand where I'm coming from. I mean, everybody's talking about family in cultural narratives in Greece. Now, this term has to also be seen as an effort to launch a genealogical critique of the function of this middle space, the public sphere. That realm in which public opinion is formed, that realm that perhaps, along with the families that we see in this field, is in trouble. This is the second last part of the paper, in which I want to, to make my argument clearer, share with you the story of Nikos. And the story is not mine, it is a story that will be taken from, I have rehearsed it in a number of publications, so maybe some of you may have seen it. But it's the story of this book, that this book tries to say. This is a novel by writer Augustos Korto, and it's called O Αφανισμός του Νίκου, The Disappearance or the Destruction of Nikos. It is 2010. I'll tell you the story for a moment. So please don't switch off if you haven't read the novel. Most people haven't read this novel. It is 2010, and the 35-year-old Nikos has everything that could make him happy. He's a young entrepreneur, owner of a successful cafe in central Athens. Everyone loves him, including his progressive and very caring family, who have realized that he is gay and wait for him to come out to them. However, at the same time, Nikos seems to inhabit a peculiar identity aphasia. He does not want to come out, he does not want to fall in love, he has not but once had sex, and is not interested in having that again, and abhors any evidence of social action or social movements, including those based on sexual identity. No gay movement for him. Deeply lonely and alienated, Nikos, on the very first page of the novel, finds himself confronting an additional hazard as he realizes that he is HIV positive and at the moment of developing full-blown AIDS symptoms. In this novel that balances between fantasy and comic elements, Nikos, contrary to any logic or political correctness, but following the very logic of that novel, decides not to listen to his doctor's advice or undergo any medical treatment. Instead, he visits a New Age magician who gives him the choice of time travel. He will take a pill and he will do time travel. Nikos decides to take that choice and asks to be transported, when do you think? Just before he contracted the virus, you would say. No, he doesn't. He asks to be transported back in the year 1972. That is, the year before he was born. His plan is to go back, meet his parents before they themselves meet, and persuade them not to marry and not to have him. What Nikos wants to eradicate is not the virus, is himself. Everything, of course, will go wrong in this playfully tragicomic novel, and Nikos will end up dying in 1972, after he tries to do various things with what eventually becomes his family. He puts fire in their house. Violence happens in 1972 because he gets out of control. These two people actually do fall in love. But he tries to do all sorts of things. He fails, and Nikos ends up dying in 1972, having possibly transported from the future a deadly virus to the unsuspecting decade of the 1970s. There is, to be sure, much more to this novel, and it's something that is coming out eventually. I have tried to write about it. But what I'm more interested in here is to theorize on what I've called, just a moment ago, identity aphasia. This numbness of identity, this short-circuiting that Nikos seems to point towards, Nikos as the character in the novel. When Nikos travels from 2010 to 1972, he goes back from a period when the Greek socioeconomic system has started crumbling slightly, but now we know it was only the beginning, to a period when public discord against the junta, the emerging youth movement in Greece, and in contact with the counter-cultural movement abroad, the larger youth movement, even in Greece, created new opportunities exactly at the level between personal identity and the state structure, that is exactly at the level of the public sphere. Because back in 1972, and that, at least in my reading of this novel, is the moment where a dynamic public sphere was possible, where radical identity politics was possible. As a number of critics and analysts have pointed out, many of the debates that punctuated public discussion in the 1970s, in the Metapolitefsi years after 1974, were issued by movements whose beginnings actually can be traced in these last junta years, in these anti-junta movements and the first Metapolitefsi dynamism. One of these movements, one that at least sprung in the first Metapolitefsi years, was the gay and lesbian movement, the gay and lesbian liberation front called AKOE, Απελευθερωτικό Κίνημα Ομοφυλοφίλων Ελλάδος. I know many of you don't know, but this is my exact point. Which rose to prominence in the mid-70s, created a big public debate then, setting for a moment a public sphere agenda, even if for a brief period, and then becoming more and more muted as the years went by. And you would say my example is narrow, but please listen to this narrow example. As I have noted on other occasions, the case of the radical feminist movement of the 1970s and early 1980s is not extremely different either. You see, I try to make it a little bit broader so that I engage more. So the radical feminist movement was the same thing. What I believe happens with those debates and those movements that are sometimes much more radical than we remember today, even, I mean, us who try to talk about them, is that they become denarrativized eventually. That is, their challenge, if you follow the Metapolitefsi years in Greece, is pushed away, the challenge is pushed away from the continuous writing of the echoing chamber that is the public sphere. Indeed, the interesting point in the development of the homosexual liberation front, the AKOE in Greece, is the way it tried, and for a moment succeeded in making its arguments very public, and in demanding a space in the social arena to discuss sexual difference, new kinship, family and national membership, gender and social role, as well as the political strategies that emanate from new arrangements of identity, community bonding, and belonging. Going back to the 1970s, a researcher today would be surprised with what a significantly rich archive there is. An archive of texts, debates, presentations, public meetings, and very public arguments and demands that at least created a public political challenge in that moment. What comes next is also of great interest, as I already pointed out. Little by little, the movement, this particular one, but also similar movements, died out and got subsumed to a much more traditional narrative of the national in the 80s. And the older categories got subsumed to the older categories of private public that the Greek public sphere was used to. Instead of debating the political challenge of movements like AKOE, like the Homosexual Liberation Front, the public consumed in the 1980s phobic narratives about homosexuality and its links to prostitution, some of them being orchestrated by the biggest national newspapers. These are the years where Ioannidou, the main supporter of the PASOK party, actually launches this campaign against homosexuality. It is the 80s. This does not mean, and this is important, that in social terms the homosexual or the radical feminist movements did not register shorter or longer term gains and did not manage to achieve a better social provision for the groups they represented. What happened alongside that, though, alongside those small gains they had, was an eventual deregistering of the deep challenges these movements issued. What I have called, as I said, denarrativization, and I want you to keep this in mind, an erasure that reaffirmed a very problematic, non-inclusive public sphere. By the mid-1980s, the radicalness and political acumen of the Homosexual Liberation Front and of radical feminism is not only a thing of the past. It is forgotten, or rather actively erased, from any narrative of the Greek social debate. It is not coincidental that in Greece of the 1980s and early 1990s there is almost no debate on HIV/AIDS, even though there is generally good provision for its victims. There is no public mourning for the victims, no debate on identity emanating from that crisis. Instead, it is again within the border, the walls, and the closed doors of the family that the AIDS crisis is played out. It returns there and stays there with shame, old understandings of pride, of private public, and national propriety, eventually gaining the upper hand. And with this context in mind, we could return to the story of Nikos, who inhabits at the year 2010 an identity that is deemed in Greece to be very private, non-political, non-vocal, and non-public. An identity whose political and public past, that is, has been fully erased. It is this Nikos who decides to die a very private death. After all, the title Ioannidou του Νίκου is doubly suggestive, as on the one hand, it uses the emotionally charged word, often used in big national narratives about the destruction of communities, Ioannidou του Νίκου, etc. And on the other hand, it could be a wordplay with the word aphanis, that is invisible. It is this invisible Nikos who decides to return to the moment where another possibility existed, the possibility of building a different public sphere, that possibility that was spectacularly made available and was eventually, similarly, spectacularly made redundant. And now, moving to my conclusion, to tie a little bit what I've tried to say, with apologies for the initial feeling of a little bit distraction because of the funny kind of setting here. And the note. What I have attempted in this paper is to bring closer to our discussion a more dynamic reading of the recent cultural production in Greece that focuses thematically on the family. Films, novels and performances that go back to the Greek family do so, I have argued, in order to speak about Greek society, but not in linear and simple ways. They are not talking about the family as an easy allegory for the nation, not even as a small part of the big problem. Rather, they are participating in a very complex dialogue developing in and about the Greek public sphere, testing ideas about belonging, identity, community, and ideology. These cultural texts are not exercises in failing kinship structures. They are exercises in genealogy. They are trying to create, that is, a genealogical critique, to find not only failures in institutions, policies, and logics of governance, but also gaps, lost moments, missed, forgotten, or silenced challenges in the domains of the social and the political that affect the present moment and can be broached more effectively in ways that engage the body, its present situation, its aporias and violent benefits. And obviously here, for those of you who are in the know, I sort of refer to Foucault's famous text on genealogy. Most of these cultural texts try to represent and engage with a larger feeling of short-circuitedness that is shared in Greece at the moment, and many of us have it as we watch, as we read, as we try to also write about all these things. Many of us have it as we try to also demonstrate or talk about what happens in this at the moment. A feeling of short-circuitedness, a shared feeling. And those cultural texts show a larger need for, among other things, a genealogical critique, and the genealogical critique of the Greek public sphere, the ways it has operated, and the modalities in which it has dealt with challenge, change, moments of crisis, moments of supersession, and moments of failing or unfailing revolt. It is actually this belief that the genealogical critique can turn failing into unfailing, failed revolt into unfailing possibilities, that has motivated many of us to engage in very public debates and to decide that our active, agonistic, and embodied readings can create a political space for cultural texts, and in terms of the public sphere, can actually make a difference.
So, since it began the Greek crisis, has entered in strong narrative structure. And narratives not only make sense of what has happened and experienced, but they offer perspective and norms of behavior. So, the making of the Greek narrative was the result of synergies between government, media, and public intellectuals. And we could include also in this group new social media and also think tanks. I think that Kevin Featherstone is gone, but I could include to this synchrony also the Greek Observatory of London. Narratives are crafted ex nihilo, but they follow established patterns or rearrange old and new material. From the beginning of the Greek crisis in 2010, there was also an interaction between Greek and foreign mass media, the one mirroring the other in the creation of these narratives. The Greek crisis became a global event from the spring of 2011 to the summer of 2012. Greek narratives are arranged around a divided line according to the Economic Adjustment Program for Greece, best known as Memorandum or Memoranda, Mnemonium, which recapitulates economic measures, public policies, and structural reforms imposed by the lenders, IMF, European Union, European Central Bank. Since 2010, there were 3 such programs, which became focal points of all political and ideological debates in Greece. As a consequence, there are 2 sets of narratives, the pro and the anti-memorandum narratives. The first memorandum created a deep crack in Greek politics and society, marking different ways of narrating the crisis. This line separated all the forces of the political spectrum from the right to the left. At the same time, both campuses are not compact or stable. The ruling party, for example, crossed the line in the spring of 2012. And since the elections of 2012, emerged also Golden Dawn, which participated in the anti-memorandum camp, retaining nevertheless underground but very concrete links with the ruling party. Each camp used its own terms which describe and at the same time explain the opposite camp. for the supporters of memorandum, who described themselves as pro-European, the opposite side combines the populism of the left with the populism of the right. Populism and neoliberalism are crossing labels by which the one camp described the other. For the pro-memorandum camp, the most common narrative of the crisis is related to the discourse of modernization. As the story goes, Greece is not yet and not completely a modern country, and the crisis is the result of an incomplete or reluctant modernization. Narratives create a mental landscape, and the narrative of modernization creates a global map of modern and not yet modern countries, but also cuts society into two parts: the modern or aspiring to be modern part, and the pre-modern or modernization-resistant part. This allochronism, this is a term coined by the anthropologist Ioannidou. This allochronism, which is at the core of the colonial viewpoint, is used not only for societies outside Europe, but also as its intra-European force. According to the audience, narratives have different versions. One version of this narrative is that Greek society is a segmentary society, Birmingham's version, without clear-cut class allegiance and divisions, based on extensive family ties and clientelism. Birmingham's called the society Paklava society. From this point of view, the crisis was the result of public debt, which was the result of the waste of money by the state. Corruption is structural because of clientelism. This term, clientelism, became a key word in explaining the Greek symptom, and the explanation goes back to the making of the Greek society in the 19th century. The history of the term clientelism or paternalism is quite intriguing in the Greek case and was central in the redefinition of historical and social sciences in Greece during the 70s and the 80s. Its use goes back to the first post-war years, when it was proposed as a tool for the social sciences regarding the Mediterranean countries in the 50s. For example, John Campbell, the Oxford historian and anthropologist, visiting the Greek mountains just after the Civil War, published an extremely influential book, Honor, Family and Patronage, a study of institutions and moral values in the Greek mountain community in 1964. This book is a sign of the boundaries of the group, of the mental map, is a sign of the mental map in which Greek society was put on the boundaries of the European world, just on the line border dividing the societies of rationality from the societies of habit, the European guild from the Mediterranean trade. So Greece was put in the realm of difference from the rest of Europe, and this affected deeply the imagination of Greek society and history. The difference of Greece from the rest of the Western European countries is an old discourse, dating from the time of the Greek War of Independence. Since then, it has structured the Greek ideology in a twofold way. On the one hand, the Greeks were not yet Europeans. On the other, Greeks were Europeans before Europeans, as having been the birthplace of Europe. Greece was either superior or inferior, but always different. Often, this discourse ended up with the need for Greeks to imitate Europeans in material culture, but to preserve their spiritual values, national culture, and language intact. This discourse of difference is not exclusively Greek, nor exclusively directed toward Greeks. It's quite common in countries of Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, and it created at the same time the sense of a European canon and of difference from the European canon. It is a transnational discourse where inter-European Orientalism interacts with self-Orientalism. Look, for example, the discourse in Poland. It's just an imprint of the Greek discourse on the Polish difference from the rest of Europe. Another version of this narrative is that Greece is not, nor is yet, a normal society, so that the crisis is a sign that should be put on the track of normality. These narratives are deeply engraved by the dichotomy between the model and its deformed imitation. This idea wasn't new, but was connected to the debate on Greek peculiarities. The idea behind is that the history of Greece is a sequence of historical absences. Greece didn't have an aristocracy, didn't pass through enlightenment, didn't have an industrial revolution or a genuine working class, and didn't have liberalism and so on. Greece just caught the last railway wagon at the last moment, and behind Greek progress lays always a foreign push and question. From this point of view, the crisis acquires a new meaning. It should be the last chance to end the Greek exceptionalism. The long-term narratives that embrace the whole of modern Greek history overlap with the short-term views which confined the default into the transition to democracy in 1974. The bottom line here is that since the end of the dictatorship, Greece followed a course in which society lived above its means. As a consequence, its debt swelled and became impossible to service. There are more popular and more sophisticated versions of this narrative which inflict a sense of collective guilt. Mazita fagra. The profligate public spending was a response to pressures from political parties and popular movements. The term used to describe this evil past is the culture of Metapolitefsi. Cultura des Metapolitefsi, the culture of transition. The term refers to the endemic protest movements and their excessive demands, to the lack of respect for social hierarchies and populism since the restoration of democracy. It's interesting that the term culture of Metapolitefsi entered in public discourse just after the urban riots in Athens in December 2008. And it was an intellectual contribution. The above narratives share the common negative consequence. They are identity discourses that they describe the self, the national self, in negative terms. Their counterpart is a moral discourse which views economic failure as a moral failure. So Greeks should conform to the common European values, should reform themselves, should do their homework. The one narrative mirrored the other, and the narrative that was emerging abroad was echoed inside with a discourse about the moralization and rationalization of Greek society. But besides this set of narratives, another series of counter-narratives emerged. These are the anti-memorandum narratives. The most popular is a narrative blaming foreigners and the Greek political system for looting the country's wealth. It's a widespread narrative in the anti-memorandum camp, in the popular press and websites, mediated by conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories is a way of reading reality as the result of intentionality. Individuals or groups stands for economic or social forces. This narrative is going saying that Greece became once more the target of foreigners with the complicity of the Greek establishment. Since the Second World War, the opposition between Greeks and foreigners is an idea deeply rooted in the Greek historical imagination, giving rise to a binary opposition in national popular culture and identity. Nikos Zvoronos, a prominent and influential historian who was exiled for a long time in Paris, gave a most formal explanation of this attitude. He wrote that the inherent character of Greek history is its antagonism to foreigners, and resistance forms a constant feature of Greek identity. Most of the followers of this narrative read the present situation through the lens of the history of the Second World War. So Greeks are supposed to be victims of the Fourth Reich, and they need a new version of resistance, a new national liberation front, uniting all the political forces from the communists to the nationalists. Social and economic problems become national problems, leading to a violation of national sovereignty. Last but not least, there is the pure and classic Marxist version of the crisis, attributing it to capitalist crisis and additionally to the intra-European immeasurabilities between North and South, between the advocates of austerity and the supporters of a loose Keynesianism. It is possible to analyze this course of both sets of narrative as a system of science without referring to the reality. Both are ethnocentric, both blame the internal or foreign political system for the performance of the economy, and both personalize the forces that led to the crisis. It's not surprising that both versions are common in countries hit by the crisis, like in Spain or in Portugal. But what I'm trying to do in this paper is to view these narratives as frameworks for political decisions and to juxtapose them with historical analysis. The focus of my paper is the narrative which blames the Metapolitefsi, because it is the ruling narrative, we would say, shared by government and mainstream mass media. In this narrative, the role of the state is crucial. And this is not the first time that the state has been blamed for its size, inefficiency, and corruption. I remind you Porter, a report just during the Civil War in 1948. But criticism involves two aspects: diagnosis and therapy. Both are interdependent and change following the shift of paradigm which engulfs diagnosis and therapy together. Both regard the dimensions and the role of the state. So, since the 1980s, there has been, globally, there has been a shift of paradigm of the thinking of the state and society at an international level. This shift was linked with the turn from Keynesianism to neoclassical theories and the remaking of welfare politics. Faced with the stagnation of the 80s and the complexity of the post-imperial, post-Cold War, post-modern society, someone needed to take the initiative to govern. Instead of the demos in the state, market forces now acquire the status of the locomotive of history. I am not using this word locomotive of history. I intentionally use this word. It's reminding who is the locomotive of history in the old Marxist schools. To understand the Greek crisis narrative, we should place Greece in this landscape of shifting paradigms of criticism of the post-war welfare state. The need for reforms, which is the idea of any approach to the Greek case, doesn't refer to any improvement of the state in general, to improve the state in general, to reform and make it better, but the transformation of the state and society according to a philosophy of what the state should be in the present. This criticism doesn't include, for example, a Weberian approach to the state, but rather is the offspring of a new conception of governance spread around the world in the period. From this point of view, Greece's reluctance or incapacity to meet the new requirements has driven it from the healthy community of nations and pushed it into the realm of the crisis. Greece was at odds with the governing rules of the new economy. Crisis is not the offspring of Greek history alone, but of the entanglement of national and international history, of Greek and European, of Greek and global history. Let's be more explicit. The Metapolitefsi period in Greece was a period of high political and social expectations, and at the same time, a period of economic stagnation and industrialization. On the one hand, there was a high level of popular mobilization, labor and student protest after decades of oppression. While in Western European countries, from the 50s to the 70s, the welfare state was under construction, in the Mediterranean countries, during the same period, it remained in an embryonic state. In Greece, the period of the dictatorship was not a rupture, but continuity with post-war economic priorities regarding financial stability, wage controls, and foreign austerity investments in big public works and industrial infrastructure. The authoritarian period was characterized by state expansion without welfare. State expansion without welfare. On the other hand, during the 70s, the backbone of the Greek post-war industrialism has broken. As a consequence, the democratic transition in Greece in 1974 was forced to sail into two boats, each one going to the opposite direction. The economy was sailing towards stagnation, while politics towards expectation for social improvement. How were these opposite directions to be bridged? Leaving the economy to solve its problems was not possible for political and historical reasons. Governments intervened through state expansion since the first day of the Konstantinos Karamanlis government. Both conservative and socialist governments opted for state expansion, although they swore by private initiative. They extended the public sector workforce and the nationalization of backup industry, problematikes βιομηχανίες, what's the name, to counterbalance unemployment created by economic stagnation. The creation of the welfare state was made possible only through public borrowing. This paradox, which created vulnerability in the crisis, was not an exception in post-war politics in creating the so-called effective demand. Its roots were set in a non-synchronicity of the paradigmatic examples of policy making. And this was not due to the social backwardness or the inertness of the Greek mentality. The post-war period in Western countries was characterized by a generalized upward social mobility and the conflating of consumerism and the ideas of the affluent society. Greek immigration to Western Europe, as well as the thousands of students who studied abroad, accelerated the lower strata's expectation for achieving European standards of life. Generation brought up in authoritarian societies understood the transition to democracy as a rapid relaxation of the social norms of social hierarchy. The spirit of the 68 was everywhere present, even without its initial political connotations. But the expansion of the state and the rise of the public debt in the 1980s didn't lead directly to the crisis of the 2010. During the 90s, there was a period of economic expansion, low rate of interest, and expansion of credit. The years of globalization were characterized by widespread optimism. The same decade for Greece, as well as for the other Mediterranean countries, was of the transformation of the economy under the impulse of globalization and European integration. While industry and production was eroded, services mushroomed. While the expansion of the economy was due to new technologies, mostly imported. It was a period of economic expansion without employment expansion. Banks and credit cards created an economic bubble of well-being under which big transformations occurred without big social reactions. Under the triumph of democracy through European integration, these transformations silently eroded the bedrock of democracy. This transformation could be described as a shift from democracy to democratics. First, this transformation dismantled the social contract through the deregulation of the economy, labor and social legislation, and the massive flux of immigrants and low-paid work. Hand in hand with the downgrading of industry, trade unionism was marginalized and political parties underwent huge transformations. The backbone of the post-dictatorship consensus, even though it was based on a soft corporatism and agreements between social partners, was broken. The new landscape appeared much more open to gender equality and to NGOs, but decision-making in the hardcore was transferred from the demos and the public realm to a tight circle of high government officials, banking executives, and large corporations, the European Commission, and think tanks. The new situation was being described by Colin Crows as post-democracy. The transition to post-democracy was smooth without any of the ruptures involved in the transition from the authoritarian regime to democracy like in the 70s. Nevertheless, it was no less decisive for the rule of the demos. Within the new framework, politics shifted to a new paradigm as the old dichotomy between authoritarian regimes and the demos was transformed into a new dichotomy between modernization and reform on the one hand, and the demos on the other. Semantically, the idea of the demos as a progressive social factor became a regressive force, an impediment to the modernizing initiatives of the elites. The narrative of crisis verbalized this conceptual shift. This semantic shift was enforced and at the same time undermined by the crisis. It was strengthened because it has framed a linear narrative of the causes leading to the crisis. This is a negative teleology. The demos became a problem in the new dispensation, and democracy was considered an impediment to new reforms. Both were at odds with the new philosophy. This philosophy includes two elements. The first is a new mental geography in which the dichotomy between government and the demos, the public and the private, no longer exists. The concept of governance and of the new public management merged public and private and creates new divisions, centers of excellence in managing the economy, and politics beyond popular control on the one hand, and on the other, populism as the form of any popular protest and reaction. The second element is that no stable social contract is possible on the shifting sands of the global economy. While in the 19th century, constitutionalism was the rule, in the 21st century, constitutions are in course of becoming empty shells. This is also a consequence of the rapid transformation of the economy under globalization. The supranational or transnational organizations which rule the economy are at odds with the principles of democracy as the representative form of the rule of the demos. In the new environment, democracy is pigeonholed and fragmented into specific spheres of the social life. Under the new transformation, the concept of the social has disappeared in the social sciences. Instead, the concept of the conflict resolution considers society as an assembly of individuals guided by rational choice. It is an epistemological transformation in most of the social sciences. The traditional background of democracy was a unified concept of the people. But already before the crisis, the concept of people was deconstructed in a scale of different belongings. Gender, class, ethnicity, and immigration made it impossible to refer to a unified subject. During the crisis, these differences have intensified, but at the same time, politics of austerity create somehow a new, large, although confused alliance. The vocation to people acquired under these circumstances a new meaning. This shift from democracy to democracies was not the result of a conspiracy to destroy democracy. And we couldn't read in such way. The crisis intensified the democracies, ascribing to the demos and democracy the causes and the responsibilities of the crisis. The transition to post-democracy and the new rules of the economy is one of the factors of the crisis, but not the only one. Since the transition became the ruling paradigm in the European Union, the regime established during the Metapolitefsi was no longer tenable. At the same time, the crisis became a tool for the acceleration of this transition and for overcoming reaction to it. Greece, as well as the other European Mediterranean countries, has become an observatory of the big historical transformations of our time. Because this transition from the authoritarian rule to democracy and from democracy to democracies, from one time of the economy to the other, has occurred within a shorter time span, a shorter historical time span, than in other countries, for example, and of course depicted in chiaroscuro, how we call it in painting.
Thank you very much both speakers for sharing parts of the fascinating work on the crisis. This is work that really helps to unravel the intricate discursive and cultural responses to the economic crisis. What can be drawn from the papers is that these responses entail a redefinition of the public sphere, a redefinition which manifests itself either in the transformation of established narratives and frameworks of political participation, as well as in the attempts to revisit movements which failed to register and transform modes of social being and belonging. The examination of these transformations and tensions within the public sphere is invaluable in understanding the narratives currently in the making. So the perspectives of the crisis you offered complement in that they identify both continuities and ruptures. The turn from demos to ethos in contemporary cultural texts seems to be inextricable from the transition from democracy to democracies. In Greece, the shortcomings of the public sphere underpin this deconstructed look at the family, not in the sense of seeking the causes of the crisis there, or establishing any strict analogies between family and the state, but rather as a means to locate the gaps in the process of formation of the public sphere. So the demo crisis, on the other hand, experienced in the aftermath of the economic crisis, in fact uncovers a democratic deficit all the way through, from the fall of the junta down to the present time. And the present demo crisis can be viewed as an intensification and amplification of the exclusions through which the public sphere operated following the first period of the Metapolitefsi. If initially the public sphere failed to incorporate the radical agendas, contemporary neoliberal discourses, and by this I mean the narratives that develop around economic restructuring and not the restructuring per se, so these narratives seem to marginalize the totality of the people, paradoxical as this may sound. So all this links back to the narrative of modernization, which arguably lies at the foundation of the Greek state since various stages of its inception. This narrative has provided the means to distinguish between the enlightened ruling classes, or the intellectual elite, the agents of modernization, Europeanization, on one hand, and the large uneducated masses, which are stuck with pre-modern values. I understand that this is a broad generalization here, and that the cultures that emerge within the left very often challenge this binary. But it seems that the crisis has reinstated a similar dichotomy. So in the modernizing neoliberal discourse, the people are represented as primitive, savages who resist reforms and economic discipline. The stereotype of the lazy, parasitical civil servant, which benefits from the state to the detriment of the state, was by no means limited to Greece. It proliferated, for example, in Cameron's rhetoric, in justification of severe cuts to public benefits. Yet, the Greek paradigm is key as an encounter between intra-European Orientalism and the anti-popular policies implemented across Europe. So let me end this short intervention, because I'm very mindful of time, with a question addressed to both speakers, but also to kickstart discussion afterwards. So it seems that the preponderance of identity politics in the last decades has often been accused of having fractured larger alliances, social alliances, ending in a dismantlement of the social front. And again, we hear today about the possibility of a unified front, but a different one. So where does Greece stand in that, given that the discussion of similar issues was by and large marginalized in the public sphere? I think that was me. We can move on to open up the floor to discussion, and then to allow room for the speakers to respond.
The second question, which you didn't make.
Okay, there's a second question, but I was trying to conform to time constraints. So if we go with the view that Metapolitefsi was a thwarted moment, like this lost opportunity to dynamically transform a problematic public sphere, could we possibly argue that the more recent social mobilization movements, which rose after the eruption of the crisis, were once again one such lost moment, and now done? We need someone to volunteer. Only time for a few questions.
It's about the role of the family. What about the role of the family, the therapeutic role of the family?
considered. There's especially recently a return to narratives about the therapeutic narrative of the family, and that narrative was suggested earlier on, some years ago, in other corners too. Also, popular culture is full of those TV series that show people return to the family and thus managing. I sort of tried to mention that my view, well, the fact that this also exists doesn't take away the kind of existence of more radical texts that talk about family as a problem. That's the one way to respond to this. And there could be sort of a longer discussion about why now some people write, for instance, much more. I mean, there will also be ethnographic and ethographic writings about the family as the crisis deepens. Exactly how much these would be sort of, I'm not going to do like a full account of everything that happens. The whole point is not exactly everything that is being written, but what is more kind of dynamically engaging in the public sphere. But what you said is also existing.
Is that better? Yes, good. Okay. So, just thank you very much for those extremely interesting talks. I wanted to say three short things. One is I wanted to thank Professor Liakos very much. Your sense of the public narratives of the crisis is brilliantly put, and it's been exactly my sense watching what these narratives have been. I wanted to ask you why you think it was possible for that first memorandum to open such a very, very deep rift so quickly in Greek society, to the point where I remember sitting with a very cosmopolitan intellectual acquaintance in Athens during a demonstration and him saying to me, "These are not my people, these are not my compatriots," referring to the trade unionists demonstrating in the streets. Second, I wanted to say that the relationship between public and private is very interesting here, something, and I think you spoke about the turn away from society and towards individualism. One thing that I've observed very much, listening to personal narratives in the crisis, is how much the public has invaded people's personal narratives of their lives. So that whereas you might in the past have sat with someone and heard about their children, their work, their love life, whatever, now, because of the situation, you hear about their struggles with their economic life, with the state, with the karatsi, with the job they've lost, all of those things. And my third point, really, which is a point for discussion coming out of that, is that how can we, perhaps, in bringing that public and private, those public and private narratives together, what is required to construct a new and different narrative that might lead to a more egalitarian, just change than the one that we're in? What sort of oppositional narratives that are both realistic and just can we possibly create, and what is required to make such a thing?
Your first point?
My first point is, why was it so easy for such a deep rift to open around the first of the month?
Sorry to bring the discussion back to the family. My question is the following. Given the inadequacies of the Greek welfare state to this day, and given the magnitude of the crisis, when the family is not able to really act as a support mechanism, where the situation is so bad for a family, I just wanted to bring in the role of the church, and whether, what your comments or your thoughts are, whether in cases like this, the church, as you know, has been very much active in Greece during the crisis. So could we speak of the church as sort of stepping in where the family is no longer able to act as a support mechanism, sort of acting in a way as a in quotation marks, as a second family? I just was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
There was a question there. This is going to be the last question, so there's still time for you to respond.
Both questions are a short one and a longer one, perhaps, for Mr. Papanikolaou. The first is a short one. In what sense are you using the term denarrativizing? And why not negate marginalizing, but denarrativizing? First of all. And then, I felt that it's a feeling, that you failed in a way to see that people nowadays, more and more, do not really care about what the media say or what the state say, or what kind of people are publicly mourned, and why not? Why is the media public sphere not Facebook or Twitter? And why is it so important that an HIV person is not publicly mourned, while he can be mourned in his Facebook page or Twitter?
No, that's also public. It's public.
I felt that you were criticizing and you did well. I mean,
talking about the
stain or the Ioannidou, but yeah, I'm just saying that.
Is there any pressing question? Well, yes, we can respond to this.
All right. The church. Obviously, what I try to do is to show this cultural text coming out of Greece now, and I'm talking about the cultural text I'm engaging, as also you may have sensed it. What I gesture towards is a kind of criticism that actually participates very much itself in the public arena. So what I pick up are the texts that I feel sort of participate in a dialogue that I also want to build on and continue. In that sense, there will always be other cultural texts to talk about in ways that we all already know about the family, etc. What I found interesting, though, something happening in Greece, is Greece return to the family as a constant debating topic and a representational topic like in culture, both as a soothing mechanism and as a problem. Yeah, there's so much more now about the family as a problem. There is also a lot about the church as a problem. And this is interesting. And this happens when people also talk about those institutions as possibilities of also support or perhaps engaging in a dialogue about the crisis and going out of the crisis or changing Greek society or you name it. But my point, I don't want to be drawn into a discussion about the church now, but my point is that at the moment, and this is what I try to do, at the moment these things come into the fore, come into public debate, and often the way people approach them is to show you that there has been something there in the past that went wrong. And in that I both converge and diverge from Antonis' point, I think, and perhaps I want your comment on that, in that I feel that yes, there may have been challenges in the past that were lost, including, for instance, movement in the church that were completely lost and forgotten, say for a number of movements that talked about a different relationship between the state and the church, or a different role of the church within the national narrative, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is that these moments, this crucial moment, people bring up these institutions and try to say that from within, or at least discussing them, you may pick up and we may broach like gaps and problems, and this is what I call genealogical critique. Now, what I said about public and private, actually, I do believe that now many things, I didn't talk so much about this moment, I believe that yes, many things are changing now in public discourse. I'm not sure if we understand that our agonistic position should be to actually think about what the public sphere is and how to make that much more inclusive, dynamic, and changing space. And this is my view. I mean, this again, I may diverge from other people in this room in that I believe in the public sphere and its possibilities.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to refer to the public sphere. The public sphere used to be a kind of unified public sphere with participation and exclusions. Then Habermas described the public sphere of 18th century, this public sphere of the elites, with the exclusion of the other people, the lower strata of the city, and of course peasants. But what happens in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, is that you have many public spheres, not one. Or you could describe it as a compartmentalized public sphere, or you have public spheres of the suburbs, or the former people who was excluded from the public sphere. So, for example, in the 80s, there is a literature saying that it's no more a kind of unique public sphere, but you have many public spheres, and the problem is how these public spheres could communicate, or if there is any kind of communication between them. And this is related with the problem of identities. Because identity, the discourse of identity is not the only responsible for creating identity, but any identity somehow, through this discourse, has created their own public sphere. What happened with the crisis? What crisis imposed is these missing links between the various public spheres. For example, in Athens, you have a public sphere of people coming from Pakistan, or from Africa, or from Albania. It is quite close and being apart from the rest of the so-called Greek public sphere. Or you have many spheres around. So the crisis has created somehow with this policy this kind of missing links between these kind of spheres. And the same happened with the identities. It used to be a big division in the left between the social left, accusing identities as a kind of separating force, and the cultural left, which is being based on the kind of politics of identities. What we have to do today is that if you have a social criticism without cultural criticism, you could have a kind of social criticism who is very similar to the social criticism of the far right. Le Pen's social criticism is a social criticism without cultural criticism. So what, on the other hand, you have a cultural criticism which is very technocratic and fits the neoliberal needs. So what we need, and what's the matter now, is to have social criticism and cultural criticism fit together. That's my point. The second question is on Metapolitefsi and the new social movements. I can't say that we could have a kind of equation. Metapolitefsi is not only a kind of popular radicalism. It was a radicalism, but it was a very, seen from the point of view of the first decade of the 21st century, the radicalism, the Greek radicalism of Metapolitefsi of the 70s, it's quite progressive. You know. For example, it was a need for freedom, but not freedom for the various identities, not freedom for minorities, not freedom, for example, for communities who had somehow provided their needs for recognition. It was a radicalism on popular sovereignty, which had been fit very well with PASOK politics in the 80s. It's not something like a missing radicalism of the 70s. We should not be nostalgic of the 70s, like a kind of the big bang of the Greek radicalism. Metapolitefsi was a very contradictory and conflictual period. And I have described it as a boat sailing, as a sailing into boats going in different directions, which was somehow reconciliated by the PASOK politics. It was this kind of PASOK politics. It was not only a politics of public borrowing and lending, but it was also a kind of, linguistic bridging the gaps. Linguistic bridge the gaps. Regarding the public-private relationship, my refer to private is not the private as the family as the private individual. It's the private enterprises, the market. And so what we have since the 90s in the framework of the philosophy of the new public management is this kind of combination between the private and the public. And you have always this kind of reducing the state, or to have the state be combined with the private sector of the economy. And what you have indeed is a kind of the private sector has the gains and the public the loss. That is not a kind of the incapacity of the Greek state to impose also the loss to the private, but it's a kind of structural structural combination. I don't support the state as an entrepreneur. What I'm saying is that the new reforms, the non-neoliberal reform, should find this kind of combination, but in another way from that used to be in the 90s and since the crisis. Because that combination was really catastrophic, and not only for Greece, Look at Africa, for example, when this kind of public management was for the first time implemented. It has resulted to a kind of compartmentalization of society, not what Veremis said, like a baklava society. It was several parts of the society resulted in the endemic civil wars we have seen in those countries. Regarding the possibility of a new narrative, I don't know what we are doing here in this conference and in other conferences also, is this kind of criticism who possibly could create the space or the material for the new narrative, but now are not made in this kind of way and thinking a narrative and I'm imposing it. And the last question for the role of the church. The church has undergone and get burden of the social welfare during the crisis. And you see, for example, in every parish they organized a lot of support for the poorer families. And we have to recognize this work of the church. But on the other hand, the church didn't undergo a kind of Metapolitefsi. And you can see that in the education, in the discourse, in the mentality of the bishops, of the personnel of the church. And that's the problem. On the one hand, you have a church that is behind all these kind of needs of the contemporary society, and you have seen that in the recent discourses on homophobia, on the anti-racist laws. And on the other hand, you have the work of the church for the support of the poor. Here we are. Here we are. That depends a lot of, and I have supported that in the past, that we need a reformed church. Not in the kind of official dogmatic reform, but in the sense that you need the personnel of the church with a better education, with contemporary values, with a kind of tolerance and even openness to the needs of the present society and culture. That's
Yes, it is a good note to end on. We can continue discussing all this during the roundtable session.
Charles, let me please don't go for the last session, because it would be also bad for the people who. Thank you very much. And what we have done with this last session would be, instead of immediately opening the floor now to reflecting on the day, we have asked for postgraduate students, postgraduate student colleagues, I should say, to talk to us about two things. The first question I put to them was to reflect on their own work and how the recent events in Greece and the recent socio-political situation in Greece has changed and made them refocus their work. So give us an example from their own research. And then at the same time, no matter how much at the same time, I have, no matter how many times I've said, please don't get me. We've asked our colleagues to also reflect on the day, so that discussion